Welcome to Session 5 of our study on the Book of Proverbs. In this session, we read and discuss chapters 16 through 20. We are in the second major unit of the book and see primarily two-line, standalone proverbs that mostly but not exclusively compare two polar opposite ideas: wise and foolish, righteous versus the wicked, industrious versus lazy, that sort of thing. We'll also see a much wider variety of proverbs than we saw last week. We'll get to see those in a minute, but first, a word of prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth, and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In these chapters, the core family is still important, along with the character of its members, but the circle of moral concern begins to widen. There is a greater emphasis on friends who are occasionally favored over family. We also greet a more diverse cast of characters, including personal enemies, nobles, princes, warriors, contenders, lenders, and hagglers. The value of reliable and trustworthy companions is stressed. We will see an ethic of neighborliness and preservation of social boundaries. We will also see more of the king appointed by and invested with the authority of God. These parables pay greater attention to the complexities of human relationships, and we will notice a new and greater concern for justice. We will hear about what is right and what is just. We're not going to read every single proverb in these chapters, but we are going to discuss a number of them. There are a lot of proverbs here. You can certainly go back and pick out some that sound interesting to you, and we can talk about any of those on their discussion on Sunday evening. We also want to remember that the Book of Proverbs is an anthology, a collection of collections of proverbs. Within this particular collection, the Proverbs of Solomon, which stretches from chapter 10 through most of chapter 22, we find hundreds of two-line proverbs that are intended to help guide our lives. So we are looking for meaning not just in each of these individual proverbs, but for some sort of cohesive message, a general direction. That may have been easier in the earlier chapters when the message seemed to have been that we should be righteous and not wicked, wise and not foolish, industrious and not lazy. Our task becomes more difficult as we see proverbs that deal with better than, proverbs that are more nuanced, as well as those that seem to contradict each other occasionally. So as we read these, think about what does tie these proverbs together. What can we learn from this unit as a whole? Chapter 16 is an important crossroad. It introduces the second half of this collection of the second unit. It is also the midpoint of the Book of Proverbs as a whole. Moreover, it introduces readers to a greater complexity of theological content in literary forms. The first 9 verses focus on the sovereignty of God. We will notice that verses 1 and 9 frame this subsection by proclaiming God's activity where we humans think we have control. Verse 1, the plans of the mind belong to mortals, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All one's ways may be pure in one's own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. The Lord has made everything for its purpose, even the wicked for the day of trouble. All those who are arrogant are an abomination to the Lord. Be assured they will not go unpunished. By loyalty and faithfulness, iniquity is atoned for, and by the fear of the Lord, one avoids evil. When the ways of people please the Lord, he causes even their enemies to be at peace with them. Better is a little with righteousness than large income with injustice. The human mind plans the way, but the Lord directs the steps. So verse 8 is the only verse in this section that doesn't mention the Lord. Robert Alter translated the opening frame from verse 1 this way: man's is the ordering of thought, but from the Lord is the tongue's pronouncing. Throughout Proverbs, articulate speech is conceived as a key to relationships among people and an indispensable instrument of wisdom. A person orders his own thoughts because there is no question about the autonomy of consciousness, but it is a gift from God when thought is translated into wise speech. The other frame in here, the first section, is verse 9. A man's heart may plan his way, but the Lord will make his steps firm. Here it is action, the step, rather than the speech that is determined by God. So we have gone from man's is the ordering of thought, but the Lord gives speech, to man plans his own way, but the Lord directs the actual first steps. Verses 10 through 15 discusses the king, God's earthly representative. Notice there appear to be three pairs of proverbs here, verses 10 and 11, verses 12 and 13, and verses 14 and 15. Let's read through those. Inspired decisions are on the lips of a king. His mouth does not sin in judgment. Honest balances and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. It is abomination to kings to do evil, for the throne is established by righteousness. Righteous lips are the delight of a king, and he loves those who speak what is right. A king's wrath is a messenger of death, and whoever is wise will appease it. In the light of a king's face there is life, and his favor is like the clouds that bring the spring rain. So this is the first extended description of kings in Proverbs. Its placement is right after verse 9, which may be a reminder that the king, like every other human, is subject to God. Verse 11 says, honest balances and scales are the Lord's. All the weights in the bag are his work. Balances and scales and weights appear to be a metaphor for the fairness and precision in which God judges the world. Today we don't necessarily think of our leaders being God's representatives, but it was a very natural way to think of a king in ancient Near East. The next four verses are at the very heart of Proverbs, not just because they are in the center of the middle chapter of the book, but because these appear to be the core messages that we as readers should take away. How much better to get wisdom than gold? To get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. The highway of the upright avoids evil. Those who guard their way preserve their lives. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is better to be of a lowly spirit among the poor than to divide the spoil with the proud. Verse 16, wisdom is better than gold, understanding better than silver, a concept we hear over and over again in this book. Verse 17 talks about the pathway we should take, the path of righteousness versus the path of the wicked. In verse 18, we recognize pride goeth before a fall. Verse 19 values humility in socioeconomic terms. This is a better than proverb. Better to be low in spirit with the afflicted than dividing plunder with the arrogant or proud. So look at the parallel structure in this proverb. Better A plus B than C plus D. This is a normal structure for better than proverbs. It may be our job to sort this type of proverb out. Why is the first line better than the second? Which is the stronger good in the first line? Is it humility, which is low in spirit? Or is it that we are with the afflicted? Which is the bad thing in the second line? Is it that we are dividing plunder? Or is it that we are hanging out with the arrogant? So we are supposed to be, at this point, have learned a little bit something about wisdom. It is up to the reader, to us, to begin making these kinds of judgments. We're not comparing the righteous and the wicked here. Based on what we have already read in this book, why is the first line better than the second? The difficult moral decisions we make are generally not between good and evil. The tough ones are more nuanced. How do we compare two options that we think we actually are faced with when neither is obviously the wise or righteous choice? For example, do we support the wicked wise man or the righteous fool? Let's go on with verses 20 through 24. Those who are attentive to a matter will prosper, and happy are those who trust in the Lord. The wise of heart is called perceptive, and pleasant speech increases persuasiveness. Wisdom is a fountain of life to one who has it, but folly is the punishment of fools. The mind of the wise makes their speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to their lips. Pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. The balance of this chapter doesn't provide any strong cohesive themes and may be said to deal primarily with the different paths we choose to take in our lives. So verses 25 through 33. Sometimes there is a way that seems to be right, but in the end it is the way to death. The appetite of workers works for them. Their hunger urges them on. Scoundrels concoct evil, and their speech is like scorching fire. A perverse person spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. The violent entice their neighbors and lead them in a way that is not good. One who winks the eyes plans perverse things. One who compresses the lips brings evil to pass. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. One who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and one whose temper is controlled than one who captures a city. The lot is cast into the lap, but the decision is the Lord's alone. So if verse 25 looks familiar, that may be because it is identical with verse 12 from chapter 14 that we read in our last session. Sometimes there is a way that seems to be right, but in the end it is a way to death. These lines confirm that alternate pathways do exist, but also tells us that it may not necessarily be easy to find the right path. In verse 30, a possible interpretation is that this is some kind of a caricature of the wicked man who exhibits these facial gestures as he plots evil. One explanation is that the eyes shut or blink, barely shutter the twisted schemes that work behind them. Pursed lips say nothing but speak volumes about an unwavering determination to see the schemes through to the completion. One who winks the eyes plans perverse things. One who compresses the lips brings evil to pass. The received text, that is the Hebrew source, uses ote, which is not a comprehensible word for closes, as in closes the eye or winks or purses. But there is a Hebrew word, atsem, which means closing the eyes, and most translators assume that that is the word that was intended here. The same Hebrew word was translated both as winks and as compresses or purses. Verse 33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but the decision is the Lord's alone. So a lot here where it's like gambling, you know how lot, tossing lots, choosing lots. The lot was apparently dropped into the lap of a seated person, but the final decision belongs to the Lord. Let's compare this to the first verse of this chapter. The plans of the mind belong to mortals, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So now let's move to chapter 17. We don't find nearly as much structure in chapter 17, 18, 19, and 20 as we did in chapter 16. There are no consistent genres, no clear themes. There are a few pairs in chapter 17, and there are some topics that are repeated, but there is no strong coherence here. So we're going to read and discuss some of these verses, but we won't read every one of them. We'll start with the first 5 verses of chapter 17. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. A slave who deals wisely will rule over a child who acts shamefully, and will share the inheritance as one of the family. The crucible is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. An evildoer listens to wicked lips, and a liar gives heed to a mischievous tongue. Those who mock the poor insult their maker. Those who are glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Let's look at the first verse here. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. The term feasting in the second line means literally sacrifice, which is to say the choice cuts left over from the sacrifices at the temple. So we're saying here that a quiet meal with a crust of bread, a crumb for basic survival, not even oil or vinegar to moisten it, is better than a contentious banquet in a house full of great food that only the affluent could afford anyway. Verse 3, the crucible is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the heart. So crucibles are used to extract precious metals from the ore. At high heat, the metal is melted, refined by pouring off all its impurities, and then tested for purity. God tests the purity of the human heart, kind of in the same way. Verse 5 aligns God with the poor. How we behave toward one, we behave toward the other. It tells us those who mock the poor insult their maker. Those who are glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Remember when Jesus said, when you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren? This is kind of the same message here. We go to verse 7. Excess speech is not becoming to a fool. Less still is false speech to a ruler. This is the first of what are called not fitting proverbs. Robert Alter translates this verse, unfit for a scoundrel, overweening speech, much less for a nobleman, lying speech. Overweening means something like showing excessive confidence or pride. The point here, perhaps, is that fine or excessively confident speech is not fitting for a fool or a scoundrel, but lies by a leader or ruler are even more loathsome, perhaps because they have greater impact. We look up to our leaders and want to believe them. We sometimes believe our rulers even what they say is contrary to the evidence. Our expectation of scoundrels and fools are much lower. We are predisposed to discount what they say to begin with. So while it is not good for fools to boast, less harm is done. Let's go down to verse 10. A rebuke strikes deeper into a discerning person than 100 blows to a fool. A sensitive, discerning person will feel the bite of a verbal rebuke more than the callous fool feels a severe beating. Verse 12 is interesting. Better to meet a she-bear robbed of its cubs than to confront a fool immersed in folly. This is a better than proverb again. It's also another one that we can convert into a riddle. What could be worse than encountering a bear robbed of its cubs? Well, running into a fool. Let's drop down to verse 26. This one is called a not right proverb. We have two parallel actions, neither of which is the right thing to do. To impose a fine on the innocent is not right, or to flog the noble for their integrity. There are things that are okay and other things that are not okay. This proverb tells us two things that are not acceptable: imposing a fine on the innocent and flogging the noble for his integrity. Not right, not good things. Verse 28 reminds us of a saying attributed to both Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain, although it's not clear where it actually came from. Probably not from either of those guys. Better to remain quiet and be thought a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. You've heard that before. Verse 28 says much the same thing. Even fools who keep silent are considered wise. When they close their lips, they're deemed intelligent. So keep your mouth shut. We're going now to chapter 18. Again, there's not a lot of obvious structure in chapter 18, so we have to look for it where we find it. This chapter begins with a proverb about the antisocial person and ends with a tribute to a true friend. See the contrast there, antithesis. We will see some proverbs about the importance of speech and the importance of listening also in this chapter. Let's begin with verse 1 of chapter 18. The one who lives alone is self-indulgent, showing contempt for all sound judgment. Robert Alter translates this as a loner seeks a pretext. Where one needs prudence, he is exposed. This may be saying that a person cut off from other people constantly looks for a quarrel, and by doing so fully exposes his own weaknesses in the very situations that call for prudence. The loner, aloof and unreasonable, may be refusing any wisdom from the community. He needs help, but he's not looking for it. He won't talk to them. We can see some pairing with the first two verses. Verse 2 says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing personal opinion. See how that sounds similar? Like the loner in the first verse, the fool here is not really interested in input from the outside, nor is he interested in discernment or prudence. You can see some tie-ins between verses 10 and 11. The architectural imagery along with the words like strong, high, and protection. Let's look at those two. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. The wealth of the rich is their strong city. In their imagination, it is like a high wall. So we have a strong tower, we've got a high wall and a strong city. Let's go on to verse 17. The one who first states a case seems right until the other comes and cross-examines. We are told here that there are two sides to every story, and we need to wait on judgment until we have heard both of them. Verse 19 is a little cryptic. An ally offended is stronger than a city. Such quarreling is like bars of a castle. This may mean that if you wrong someone close to you, he becomes bristlingly defensive, shutting himself off from you like a fortified city, perhaps. Verse 21, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. This proverb refers to language. A cultivated person delights in the language and takes pleasure in its proper use. The exercise of well thought out expressions will profit a man. And finally, in this chapter, let's look at verse 24. Some friends play at friendship, but a true friend sticks closer than one's sibling. Remember in the first verse in this chapter, we saw someone who has isolated or separated himself from others, focusing on himself and consequently getting himself into trouble. This verse affirms the sustaining power of friendship, the opposite of what we saw in the first verse. Fox suggests a nuance of contrast between the first and second lines of this verse. There are companionable people with whom one may enjoy social interaction, but there are also intimate friends, closer than a brother. So a comparison in here. Many of the Proverbs in chapter 19 emphasize the value of instruction, but overall there's not a lot of structure in this chapter either. Verse 4, wealth brings many friends, but the poor are left friendless. Here the proverb is not really offering moral instruction, but an observation about the way things are. People flock around the rich and avoid the poor. Verse 6 makes an essentially the same point. Many seek the favor of the generous, and everyone is a friend to a giver of gifts. Verses 5 and 9 are almost identical in this chapter. A false witness will not go unpunished, and a liar will not escape. A false witness will not go unpunished, and the liar will perish. Verse 9. Let's look at verse 14. House and wealth are inherited from parents, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. This proverb suggests that a man may depend on his parents for the inheritance of wealth and a house, but God alone can grant him the gift of a prudent or clever wife. Verse 19 apparently is one of those somewhat challenging to translate. A violent-tempered person will pay the penalty. If you effect a rescue, you will only have to do it again. Robert Alter translates this as, a very hot-headed man bears punishment. Try to save him, you will make things worse. Yoder suggests that not only will the angry not learn and likely repeat their wrongdoing, but their rescuers wind up trapped, consigned to intervene again and again and again and again without success. Verse 24 is interesting. The lazy person buries a hand in the dish and will not even bring it back to the mouth. This includes both some satire and hyperbole. Why is his hand hidden in the dish? Because that's where the food is. But he is too lazy to pick the food out of the dish and eat it. This lazy bones is too lazy to even provide for his own basic needs. Let's go to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is an assortment of proverbs with very few indications of any structured arrangement whatsoever. We will start with verses 2 and 3. The dread anger of a king is like the growling of a lion. Anyone who provokes him to anger forfeits life itself. And then verse 3. It is honorable to refrain from strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel. Obviously, fools are not honorable, but after looking at verse 2, can we not imagine the fool is stupid enough to pick a fight with the king? He's not going to survive that. Don't do that. Verse 7, the righteous walk in integrity. Happy are the children who follow them. This proverb reiterates how intertwined the generations are. We could be talking physically or metaphorically. The children follow in their parents' footsteps. It could be physically they're following, or it could be metaphorically they're following. They do the same things their parents did when they grew up. Verse 14 could be interpreted in two different ways. It's an interesting one. Bad, bad, says the buyer, then goes away and boasts. This could describe a consumer who dismisses the merchandise as utterly inferior, whether or not it actually is. Then he goes off congratulating himself on how smart he is. Or it could mean that after he complains, the price comes down and he buys it, praising himself for his shrewdness. What do we learn from this? What's the moral of the story? Think about that. Verse 22. Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord and he will help you. This may recall the story of David and Abigail in 1 Samuel 25. David is enraged that his men are insulted by her husband Nabal and is on his way to wreak vengeance when Abigail implores him not to shed blood, but to leave vengeance to the Lord. Verse 26. Wise king winnows the wicked and drives the wheel over them. This is probably a reference to the wheels of a chariot with which a triumphant king would crush a defeated enemy. And finally we read verse 30. Blows that wound cleanse away evil. Beatings make clean the innermost parts. Let's read that one again. Blows that wound cleanse away evil. Beatings make clean the innermost parts. The most likely meaning for this one is that the only appropriate way of dealing with an evil person is to beat the living daylights out of them. So we come to the end of chapter 20. We've seen a much greater variety of proverbs in these chapters than what we have seen in the past couple of weeks. We've heard about kings as God's earthly instruments or earthly representatives. Occasionally we have seen proverbs that just tell us how the world works, not necessarily whether it's morally right or not, but this is just how it is. We have seen some more comparative proverbs. It's better to do this than to do that. And some that just seem to be a nuance. Next week, we conclude the collection that we've labeled the Proverbs of Solomon. We'll read a new collection of proverbs about 2 chapters long called Sayings of the Wise, part of which is thought to be an adaptation of an Egyptian wisdom text. And we will see some proverbs that appear to be composed in more than the one-verse format that we have seen thus far, some 2 verses together. We will also read about a dozen proverbs from an again different source labeled These Two Are From the Wise. All in all, we will read chapters 21 through chapter 24 in session 6. Until then, have a good week, and I hope to see you Sunday.